Welcome to What Works. Many leaders in Africa have long complained that Western countries and other agencies in the global north have for long neglected development of infrastructure on the African continent. And they do have a point, because many aid agencies from the global north stopped funding infrastructure projects like roads, buildings, bridges, etc. From the 1950s and 60s. There were lots of project evaluations, aid evaluation studies that found that projects that were constructed ended up being so-called white elephants, projects that were not used for the right purposes. Studies showed that these projects were very expensive and not very effective. So for many decades, African politicians have been saying we really need somebody to come and build roads, invest in our infrastructure. It could be hydroelectric power, coal-fired power plants, bridges, hotels, whatever. And the one country that has really made a big splash on the African continent in recent decades, and they're by no means new entrants, is China. China has been in Africa for many, many decades. But in the last couple of decades, China has really upped its aid and investment activities on the African continent. And the clearest and most visible form of that activity is in relation to infrastructure projects. And I will be here talking to you about two countries and two sets of projects. One is a railway project in Kenya, and another country that I have been studying is Malawi, and I'll be discussing this later on, talking about the various kind of infrastructure projects that China has been developing. Now, what is it that actually distinguishes Chinese aid and investments from Western aid and investments? Well, one of the things that the West has typically chosen to focus on is sometimes called soft areas of development. Soft not as in unimportant, but not hard as in infrastructure. So the West typically provides assistance in terms of health, education, and budget support that the Chinese feel is just really not their cup of tea. The Chinese say that we actually want to make a difference. So the Chinese model builds on the idea that local leaders, national leaders make a list of projects that China can fund. China then has a look at these lists and says basically we can do one or two or maybe three. Some of it will be based on a grant, which is basically a gift. Others will be based on a concessional loan. And this is very different from many of the Western aid projects that are typically just grants and not loans. So the Chinese system differs both in relation to what it understands as aid, and which is very different from the Western understanding of aid. China uses a combination of aid, that is grants, with concessional loans, and encourages its own private sector to contribute to building different types of projects and undertaking different activities in many of these countries. So another way in which China is different is that China actually builds these things on its own. It has for long been getting Chinese laborers, Chinese engineers, Chinese officials, importing them to some of these country contexts, using local labor. There's been a criticism that they haven't been using as much local competence as they should be. But nonetheless, China gets most of its stuff from China. It procures the raw materials, the machines, etc., builds projects in record time, and then has been traditionally handing these projects over to local authorities for their use. And thereby China says basically, okay, we've constructed it, now it's up to you to maintain it. Now, that simple model of building, transferring ownership, and then leaving is changing. In more recent years, countries and their governments are saying basically, could you please also help us maintain some of these structures? For example, if you built a very nice building using marble imported from China and the marble has cracked, how do we replace this? Or a lift, an elevator in a hotel or in a particular conference center, again, imported from China, is not working. Only Chinese mechanics can service these. So China is getting slowly dragged into this kind of long-term commitment that the West often is pretty much accustomed to. Another very important narrative from the Chinese aid and investment perspective is that they insist that projects are, first of all, they keep their word. If they promise $100 million, they will provide $100 million. And if they do promise that a project will be completed on a certain date, it is absolutely sure it will be, perhaps even ahead of schedule. So there is this kind of track record that China has in undertaking major landmark infrastructure projects, completing them on time, often ahead of schedule, and then basically handing these over. And the narrative is that China does not engage in projects that are unnecessary but are based and dictated by national policy priorities. So China would not necessarily say no to a project that is of real importance to a country, whereas Western donors are often accused of basically deciding what a country deserves or what kind of projects that they would be able to fund. Another very important part of the Chinese aid narrative has been that China is not a developed country. It is not a superpower. It does not aim to become one. In fact, the typical rhetoric is China is the largest developing country in the world, and that most of this kind of assistance being offered to countries in Africa and many other parts of the world is based on a win-win rhetoric or logic, or the principles of win-win. It's not something China is doing just out of the kindness of its heart. It also wants something in return. It makes this very clear. It is based on mutual respect, solidarity. All of these principles are often highlighted by Chinese ambassadors, visiting dignitaries, politicians, ministers, etc. So, but making the claim that China is not a rich country and it is the largest developing country in the world actually serves a very important point here. China does not want some of these so-called recipient countries to want even more. So there's this kind of idea that, listen, we've agreed on this amount and that's it. Don't expect more because we actually are still developing, and China says that it still has 200 million people living in poverty. So all of this justifies this kind of a relationship based on win-win. It is not just a rich country giving money or giving assistance to a poor country that one talks about more South-South collaboration. China talks about its impressive record at solving poverty, eradicating hunger, lifting almost 500 million people out of poverty in 15 to 20 years. China says basically, look, we've solved these problems of hunger. We can help you improve your agricultural sector, reform it. We can show you how to do this. So China builds agricultural technology demonstration centers in many parts of Africa. The idea is that one should not just provide a grant, but actually provide knowledge. Now, all of this, of course, means that China is somewhat or very different in terms of its aid and investment practices from many other countries, but this has also resulted in a lot of criticism. So particularly in the United States, but also in many European capitals, the initial response was that all of this kind of activity of China in Africa is going to result in poor governance. All of the investments that the West had in terms of promoting good governance and anti-corruption efforts is going to go down the drain. And there are some legitimate concerns there. I've already mentioned that some African countries themselves are not very pleased with the kind of emphasis on getting everything from China, not doing any local procurements, etc. But I do see on the ground that despite these problems and criticisms, the fact of the matter is that African countries like Kenya, like Malawi, have been able to build much necessary infrastructure, and without Chinese involvement, this would not have been possible. So that's one set of issues. The second set is Chinese diplomacy, and I think China has been very suave and very clever in portraying its activities, so far at least, as being win-win, not just a rich country giving a handout, by insisting that it also needs something back from these countries in return for its own assistance. China conveys a sense of pride to many of these African countries and the leaders that they're not useless, they're not hopeless basket cases. They also actually have not just oil, but they have copper, and they have cotton, they have tobacco, all kinds of other resources. So to conclude, I think despite the kind of criticism that China is often accused of in terms of its own assistance and investment policies, and there are lots of valid criticisms there. The crucial point here is what is working is the kind of infrastructure projects that China has been able to undertake in large parts of the African continent.